Hi everyone, just doing a behind the scenes video part 2 for the 2018 Christmas light setup. I thought I'd go into a bit more detail of the controllers and power and cabling. The previous video, which you can I've got linked below, just goes over what the actual lights are and the different elements that we've got this year, particularly the newer ones for the 2018 show. But yeah, this one we'll get into lifting the lid literally on what's happening to control these things. So starting with power, I guess from a safety perspective, try and limit as little 240 volt power in Australia, by the way, for those viewing overseas. So 240 volt power, try and reduce as much of that in the yard as possible. And I literally only have one lead that's out on the front lawn here that comes out to power things. So I have no more 240 volt store-bought lights or blow-ups or anything like that in the display anymore. It's pretty much all low voltage. So that 240 volt lines, I've got one. There's a yellow cable that comes down here into this controller box here, and there's also another 240 volt cable that comes in to the power supply and controller box for the mega tree here. So just quickly on the mega tree box, I won't open it up, but basically there is a 600 watt 12 volt power supply in there, and that supplies all the power injection points for all the nodes on the tree, and also supplies power to the J1 Sys P2 controller. That controller only has two outputs, and I do use both. When the tree is fully loaded as a 360, it pretty much just maxes out the number of channels that controller can handle. But thankfully, because I'm not using all 360 degrees of the tree, I'm using about 220. It's about 840 pixels, I think, in total is what I'm using. It means that I've got a few spare channels on the controller, which has meant that I've been able to daisy chain the end of the tree strands and go up to the top of the star topper there, which has got I think 15 or so modules in there. So yeah, so that's all running off the one controller, and it has its own dedicated power supply. I've got an outdoor PowerPoint there, which has got excuse me, some digital AC timers which turn on the power supplies automatically just before the show starts. They both come on about 20 seconds apart from each other, so there's no massive rush of power going to the power outlet, but it's been quite reliable, coming on every night and shutting off every night, so I don't need to come out and do it manually. So that 240 volt power comes down to the middle of the yard here, and underneath this present, it's hiding some ugly boxes, but they're important boxes nonetheless. But they don't look very Christmassy, so just fabricating a couple of quick core flute boxes means that you can make the display look a bit more festive while hiding some of the less festive looking things. So this top one here is what we refer to here in Australia as a master's box, which basically is just an enclosure, a waterproof enclosure. I use the term waterproof loosely, to hide a 240 volt power board, and from that I've got these two power leads here, actually go underneath and into this enclosure here, which has my moving heads, so they require 240 volt, and then the other two leads here, one goes down to the bottom box here, which is a 12 volt power supply, and the other one is going over to this other box here, which I'll open up in a second, which is a 5 volt power supply. So on top here, this is basically 240 volt power supply where required, and as I mentioned below, that is a 12 volt power supply with fusing, and that's just supplying 12 volt power injection to the 12 volt items at the front of the yard, which are the arches, strip, the Coro stars, and also the Coro presents under the tree. They're all the elements that are being supplied power from this box. Quickly put that back. They're held down with just tent pegs just to hold the boxes in place. This is a new box for this year. A smaller one because it's only the one power supply. This is a 5 volt power supply. This is a Meanwell one. So again, 5 volt power supply. There is fusing here as well for the power injection points, and this is a differential receiver. Now I have done a separate video on this setup and I will link to that below because I go into a bit of detail on that, but essentially one of my main controllers, which is up here, which I'll give you a peek at in a second, you can run a network cable, Cat6 cable down to here, and I've got 4 or 3 of those ports able to be supplied out here. So these 3 ports are sending out data to the Coro presence because it's too far away from the main controller. I'd get data loss issues, so it's going to those, and that's also feeding the arches, the stars, and the 5 volt candy canes as well. So the way I've got it is it comes out of one of these, one of those outputs goes into the arches, it feeds along all of those, and then it comes back through to the stars, and then it stops. I've then got another output which feeds just the candy canes, all 6 of those in a row, and then the third output down here is feeding all the pixels in the Coro presents. So that's a new box for this year out in the yard, hence the shinier looking present cover. So that's pretty much all the stuff that's out on the front yard. The main controller for the rest of the lights around the house, so the floods, the spinners, the spider web / snowflake, stars, all these motifs and sign, that motif and the singing faces, all of those are controlled from this controller here. So this is the Falcon, this is the F16 V2 from a couple of years ago, and underneath it is a 12 volt power supply, which is supplying 12 volt power to most of the props I just mentioned then. So I'm not using all of these outputs as yet, still got plenty of room for expansion. As I said, I've done a previous video on this, but this cable here is sending the data out down the yard to that differential receiver, so that I've got closer outputs to the lights themselves. And it means the way that I've got it set up is this green lead here is actually going out to DMX. So that DMX lead goes out to the moving heads, which are old school DMX protocol. And again, nice Coro box to cover the nastiness and to also protect it a little bit more from the weather. That power supply also gives power to the Falcon board, and that's the 240 volt supply there. Everything else that's down here are all power injection leads or data leads going to all the various items. Safety first, so this is a walkway. It's the way that we get to our front door, so the cables that do need to come across here are securely fastened with gaffer tape. That stays there and is not a trip hazard. Plenty of cables, network cables, etc. So I've got power and data for the P10 panels here, which also has a Beaglebone black to drive them, and all those cables are nicely hidden in this cable tidy thingamajig, and then down here it's just a bit of a mess, but it doesn't matter. This is a 5-volt power supply and fusing, and this power supply is for the P10 panels up here, and also these 5-volt nodes, which are the motives, and this Merry Christmas sign. I need to open the garage. I'll be back with you in one tick. And like magic, the roller door is up. So the P10 matrix is 25 panels. It's pretty much self-enclosed, weatherproofed, and it has a 5-volt power supply, plenty of fusing, and the Beaglebone black with Octoscroller cape, which drives all the panels. I just move this in and out of the garage during the day, so it's not in full sunlight most of the day, it's actually inside the garage. But right here is the brains of the entire thing, the entire show. So I've got mostly the network cables coming in from outside controllers into here, and this is what it looks like. So we have a network switch, which is now getting quite full. Admittedly, I do have a spare cable here if I need to plug in my laptop to do any tweaking of the show, but essentially this network switch means that you can connect up to 7 devices plus an input for it, and this works fine for my show for now, unless I need to expand with new controllers. Then I'm going to have to probably get an additional switch or a bigger one. Underneath that, tucked away in a case, is the Raspberry Pi, which is the show player, which has the Falcon Pi player or FPP software loaded on, and that's what transmits all the data out through the Ethernet cable into the switch, and then that broadcasts out to all the controllers for the show. Has a USB sound card that plugs into my EDM transmitter, FM transmitter. I then have an old stereo which we use for speakers out in our pergola area, but I've attached a speaker to that, and that's the speaker that's out in the front yard. So the speaker that's out in the front yard is actually the broadcast of the show. It's not a direct feed. So the Pi is powered, Pi and the switch are powered 24/7. I never switch them off, pretty much from October when I do a Halloween show. So the only thing that's being switched on and off, again, I've got another 240 volt timer here to help switch the power board on. So all these leads are going out to the power supplies nearby, as well as the stereo and the FM transmitter. But yeah, the Pi and the switch are on 24/7, so if I need to upload sequences before the show starts, I can do that. Make changes to the sequence order, etc. That can be done too. The final piece of equipment that I haven't covered off is one of these network cables, and some of the data and power cables go over to this side of the garage. And this is the final piece of equipment. This is a J1 Sys P2, and that is controlling all of the light on the roof and the garage, so all the strip lighting. And that is a 12 volt power supply that is providing all the power and power injection for those. So I'll just run the cables up and over around here, so they're out of the way, so the roller door can still move freely. And then those cables go up to the strip, and then the strip goes from here. So that's the starting data point. That's a power injection T-piece. And then from here the data line just goes all the way along the guttering, right the way down to the edge, goes up onto the roof, up to the peaks, comes back across the top, down to the side, and then just literally finishes right at the end here. That's all on one output of the P2. The second output of the P2 comes in at the bottom here, goes up this wall, across the front, and down the other side. I think I mentioned in the previous video I'm going to replace this strip with nodes next year, so that'll be a project for 2019. But that pretty much wraps it up from the behind the scenes bits and pieces. By all means, if you've got any questions, feel free to leave them down below. Thanks for watching.